The hillside erupted in a final, thunderous blast. Earth sprayed into the air like dark confetti, and a wall of smoke rolled across the crumbling trench line where Obergefreiter Karl Bäumer crouched beside a splintered radio post. His ears rang. The signal lines were dead, and the familiar bark of German commands had been drowned out by the whistle of incoming shells. Then, silence. Not peace, only the kind of silence that follows destruction. "Karl!" a voice rasped beside him. It was Friedrich, his younger brother by 3 years, pale-faced and bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow. Karl reached out instinctively, gripping Friedrich's sleeve and pulling him to cover beneath a sagging canvas tarp. The outpost had held for 12 days under constant shelling. Food nearly gone, water a ration of melted snow and mud. Now it was gone. Boots, foreign ones, crunched across loose gravel outside the trench. Shadows shifted against the smoke. Karl's breath caught. He could hear voices speaking English, shouting for surrender. The Allied troops were moving in. A loud voice barked over a megaphone. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands above your heads. You will not be harmed." Karl looked at Friedrich. "They've overrun the line," he said, barely above a whisper. Friedrich's jaw clenched. "They'll shoot us." "Not if we don't give them reason," Karl muttered, standing slowly and raising his arms. The others followed, one by one, emerging from foxholes and makeshift dugouts like ghosts surrendering to daylight. They were marched out of the remains of the hillside position. 38 men in total, stripped of weapons, helmets, and pride. Their uniforms were caked with ash and blood, their boots sinking into mud as they trudged down the slope. The last flag of the outpost, half burned, hung limply from a snapped wooden pole. American soldiers encircled them, their rifles lowered but not relaxed. Some of them looked like teenagers, others hardened and grim. One of them offered a tin cup of water to a wounded German who had collapsed at the edge of the formation. The soldier's face was unreadable, but his gesture made Karl uneasy. This wasn't how he'd imagined surrender. As they were herded into the backs of open-bed trucks, some of the German men exchanged quiet glances. A few mumbled prayers. Others muttered bitterly in disbelief. "They'll shoot us in the woods," hissed Corporal Meissner, eyes scanning the treetops. "No," said Sergeant Vogel, older and slower moving. "They want us alive. To humiliate us. To parade us like animals." Friedrich shook his head, his hands shaking. "No one gives prisoners water before an execution. It's a trick. They'll drug us, experiment on us like rats." Karl said nothing. He had been a mechanic before the war, not a prophet, but he noticed how one American soldier gently handed him a wool blanket when the wind picked up. The soldier didn't smile, didn't speak, just nodded once and walked away. It made Karl's skin crawl more than any shouted threat. The trucks jolted to life. Wooden planks lined the walls, and the prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder, pressed tight like cattle, their backs stiff with fear. The canvas flap above them did little to shield the wind. They traveled westward, past charred fields and ruined stone walls, through villages with names they couldn't pronounce, where local boys on bicycles followed the convoy and old men spat in the dust as they passed. In one village, a line of strange-looking tractors sat unmanned beside a warehouse, massive machines that looked more like monsters than farming tools. Friedrich stared at them wide-eyed. "I thought they'd send us to a Soviet camp," he whispered. "Why are we still going west?" "Because they want to show us something," Dietrich Kerner said from the far end of the truck bed. The Hauptfeldwebel sat tall, his coat buttoned tight, his field journal held in one gloved hand like a sacred artifact. "And whatever it isn't mercy." Night fell by the time they reached the rail yard. The train waiting for them wasn't like the ones they used for troop movements. These cars were wooden, their slats aged and splintered. A few prisoners hesitated, stepping back instinctively. An American guard motioned forward, not unkindly, but firmly. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of straw, rusted iron, and fear. No seats, no windows, just slits of pale moonlight slicing through the planks. The door slammed shut behind them with a finality that felt like burial. A soft, scraping sound echoed through the dim car. Someone near the far wall was carving something into the wood with a jagged belt buckle. Carl leaned over to look. It was Dietrich. He scratched the words in slow, careful strokes, his hand steady even as the train began to lurch forward. "We may not return," Carl read aloud, his voice barely above the rattle of the tracks. Dietrich didn't look up. "History needs proof," he said quietly, "even if no one sees it." The train groaned as it picked up speed, heading into the unknown. Carl sat back against the cold wall, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes wide open. Somewhere in the next car, someone began to cry. No one spoke again for a long time. Carl breathed through his nose. The air was stale, but beneath the scent of oil and dirt, something else drifted in from a nearby transport crate. Warmth. Yeast. He sniffed again, confused. Friedrich whispered beside him, voice tight with fear. "Do you smell that?" Carl nodded slowly. "Bread. They told us we'd see hell, but no one described it smelling like fresh bread." The first scream came from the back of the column. It was Friedrich. He had spotted the chimney above the dining hall and froze in place, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. The line of German POWs behind him buckled and swayed like a chain pulled tight. Carl reached for his brother instinctively, but Friedrich had already dropped to one knee, his face pale. "It's a crematorium," he whispered more to himself than to anyone else. "They tricked us." "Get up," Carl hissed under his breath. "You're drawing attention." But the guards didn't move. Not a single rifle was raised. No one shouted. Instead, a lanky American soldier with a clipboard glanced over and gave a confused wave to a fellow in the distance. The man, Private First Class Elliot Green, jogged over, his boots thudding lightly against the gravel path. "You all right there?" Elliot asked. He didn't shout. His voice was even, tired, young, barely more than a whisper compared to the artillery barrages Carl had grown used to. Friedrich looked up at him, blinking hard, searching his face for cruelty or command. There was none. Elliot shifted his weight, unsure. He glanced down at Friedrich, then back at Carl. "He sick?" "We can get the medic." Carl opened his mouth, but no words came. Elliot nodded slightly anyway, then leaned into his radio and said something in English too fast for Carl to catch. Friedrich was helped to his feet, not by force, but by suggestion. The group was quietly ushered toward the long barracks beyond the gates of Camp Fort Devonshire. What they saw next broke the rhythm of every warning they'd ever received. No guard towers faced inward, no dogs barked. Instead, wooden signs lined the inner perimeter. U.S. Army, restricted zone, civilians keep out. The prisoners were led past a row of laundry lines, then into a narrow sorting hall where they were handed clean uniforms, bar soap, and canvas bags containing basic rations. No one shouted. No boots stomped. No threats followed. Inside the main administration building, a stout American sergeant named Nolan O'Brien carefully recorded names from the prisoner manifest. His voice, low and gravelly, carried the boredom of repetition more than menace. "Hauptfeldwebel Dietrich Kerner," he read, then looked up. "You speak English?" "Some," Dietrich replied stiffly. "Good." Your squad lead O'Brien scribbled Dee a note. "You'll help enforce order here." "We don't do beatings. You don't do escapes. We good?" Dietrich didn't answer. That evening the mess hall buzzed with unfamiliar smells. The air was thick with something warm, yeasty. Friedrich stared at the long chimney on top of the kitchen as if it were watching him. "It's not a crematorium," Carl whispered. "It's a bakery." "I saw the dough. They're hiding something," Friedrich muttered. "Then why give us blankets?" Carl asked quietly. "Why offer letters home?" Friedrich didn't respond. They were seated at long wooden tables inside the hall. The benches creaked under the collective weight of men taught to expect punishment in every act of silence. Elliot Green stood nearby, arms folded, watching. He had been assigned to oversee the German barracks after requesting a posting away from the front. His brother, Charles, had been buried in a field in Normandy 6 months earlier, and Elliot carried that loss like a coiled spring behind his ribs. But when he looked at the prisoners tonight, skinny, hollow-eyed, shoulders slumped, he didn't feel rage. He felt confusion. Why did they look terrified of soup? He watched one soldier sniff the broth like it was acid. Another tried to pocket his spoon. Friedrich pushed his bread aside entirely. "They think we're poisoning them," Elliot muttered to Sergeant O'Brien. O'Brien just grunted. "Can't say I blame 'em. They probably heard what our boys did in the Pacific. Doesn't mean we're the same." Later that night, Carl sat on his bunk, rubbing the bar of soap between his palms as if trying to solve it like a puzzle. "It smells like flowers," he said aloud. "No, it doesn't," muttered another prisoner from the corner. "It smells like chemicals. Like chloroform. They'll gas us when we're asleep." Carl didn't argue, but he stared at the soap anyway, watching the lather build and slide over his fingers. He hadn't seen foam in months. Not like this. Not clean. Outside, Elliot walked the perimeter of the wire fence, watching fog curl along the outer road. A jeep passed slowly, headlights dim. Somewhere in the woods, a coyote howled. The camp was quiet. The kind of quiet that invited fear, not peace. Back inside, Carl finally unwrapped the paper envelope he'd been given. It was stamped with a red triangle. Mail, subject to censorship. A small pencil rolled out. No orders, no threats, just space. He looked at the blank page. What was he supposed to say? "We're not dead? We're warm?" He stared at the empty sheet long into the night, pencil unmoving, fingers frozen. Across the barracks, Dietrich was pacing. The old sergeant still barked orders, trying to enforce posture drills in the yard each morning. But fewer men obeyed. They didn't disobey, they simply drifted, as if the shape of authority had lost its outline. One morning, a junior guard named Henry Clark attempted a broken joke in German. It didn't land, but Emil, the youngest POW in Carl's group, gave a nervous chuckle. It earned him a glare from Dietrich. Later, Carl overheard Dietrich muttering under his breath, "They'll make you forget who you are." That's how it begins. But something else had already begun. By the end of the week, chessboards were handed out. Mail began arriving. Friedrich had written nothing, but a letter still came addressed to him, from their mother. The Red Cross had traced him somehow. Elliot was the one to hand it over. "It's real," he said simply, watching the German boy's eyes scan the return address with trembling hands. That night, Friedrich didn't sleep, but he didn't cry either. Carl flipped through his field journal under the flickering bulb of the bunk lamp. Between sketches of troop positions and ration counts, he began a new page. He drew the oven chimney, then a spoon, then a chessboard. Then he wrote in small, careful script, "We were trained to resist torture, but not kindness." The door creaked open with a hollow groan, and the first thing Carl Boehmer noticed was the heat. A dry, steady wave that rolled out from the center of the camp kitchen like breath from some unseen beast. The prisoners stepped in slowly, their boots tapping against the tiled floor with hesitant rhythm. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead. At the room's heart stood a steel oven, tall and square, its bolted doors darkened by years of use. Carl froze. He had seen something like it once, years before, in a photo passed secretly among soldiers in Sicily. That oven had stood in a different kind of place, a darker place. Here it roared all the same. Carl's stomach twisted. "You!" barked the guard behind them. "Boehmer, you help the baker today. Rest of you, stand by the wall." Carl's breath caught in his throat. He glanced toward Friedrich, who was pale and stiff. One of the younger prisoners whispered something in German. "They're choosing the first to go." Another muttered, "Why else bring us to the kitchen?" The American in the white apron, an older man with thick arms dusted in flour, stepped forward. His hair was black and slicked back with sweat, a rag slung over his shoulder. He pointed to Carl and waved him closer with a flour-coated hand. "Come on," the man said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "You're on bread today." Carl's boots felt welded to the floor. His mouth was dry. When he didn't move, the man approached and held out what looked like a flat wooden paddle. "Peel," he said, tapping the tool's long handle. "You take the dough," he mimed, scooping. "Slide it in." He pointed toward the oven, then grinned. "Not you, kid." The bread. A few of the prisoners let out nervous chuckles. Carl didn't laugh. The man introduced himself as Sal Donetti. Italian-American, judging by the name, and built like someone who'd never missed a meal. He whistled as he worked, some old Sinatra tune echoing against the kitchen tiles. Carl watched him stretch, fold and knead dough like it was second nature. His thick fingers punched into the pale lump with rhythmic confidence. Sal looked up and gestured. "You gonna stand there all day, or you gonna help me feed the camp?" Carl stepped forward slowly, eyes flicking from Sal's hands to the steel oven. The metal beast sat silent for a moment, then emitted a soft whoomp as its internal burner kicked up. Carl flinched. "You okay?" Sal asked, pausing his whistle. He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he tore a chunk of dough and handed it to Carl. "Here." "You shaped this." Carl stared at the dough in his palms. It was sticky, soft, warm, like flesh. His fingers tensed. The fear in his chest returned, irrational and enormous. "I don't," he whispered. "Yeah, I know," Sal said. "You're not a baker." "That's all right." He tapped Carl's chest lightly with a knuckle. "But you got hands." "And we got mouths to feed." Carl began shaping the dough, clumsy and stiff at first. Sal nodded, correcting his movements wordlessly. Press, fold, turn, repeat. A rhythm built, slow but steady. The tension didn't disappear, it settled deeper, quieter. Sal handed him the peel. "Let's get that loaf in." Carl's legs moved as if detached from thought. He opened the oven door, and the roar of flame met his face. Heat blasted his skin. He felt his hand tremble as he slid the raw loaf forward. The wood scraped metal. Sal reached over and helped guide it. "Close it." Carl obeyed. Minutes passed. Silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the low hum of the oven and Sal's soft whistling. Other prisoners peeked over from their place by the wall, watching like children around a campfire. Then came the smell. Warm, rich, familiar. Carl blinked. The air was thick with yeast and roasted grain, real bread. Not ash, not burning hair. He stepped back, breath shallow. Sal opened the oven and reached in. The peel came out with a golden brown loaf sitting perfectly atop it, steam curling upward like a whisper. "Not bad," Sal said with a wink. "You sure you're not a baker?" Carl couldn't speak. He stared at the loaf, the crust gleaming in the light, the air around it vibrating with impossible comfort. From the wall, one of the younger soldiers stepped forward, unable to stop himself. He squinted. "It's real," he whispered in disbelief. "Just bread." Carl let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in weeks, something inside him began to thaw. "We waited to burn, and instead, we fed the camp." The reprimand came swiftly. Emil Kruger sat on the edge of his bunk, his letter trembling slightly in his fingers as the American clerk read the last line aloud. "I have eaten bread beside my captors and felt no hatred in their hands." The man, mid-40s, square-jawed, didn't frown or raise his voice. He simply folded the letter in half and said, "This section won't make it past review." Emil opened his mouth to protest but hesitated. The clerk's eyes weren't cruel, just tired. He stamped the letter, redacted, and tossed it into the pile. Across the room, Carl Boymer watched from his cot, eyes narrowing. The mail tent smelled faintly of ink, canvas, and drying snow tracked in from outside. He returned to his own journal, flipping to the back where he had started recording baking temperatures and oven times. But just beneath the last note, "Loaves need 17 minutes after second rise," he scribbled a line in German. "Sie sind nicht, was man uns sagte." They are not what we were told. That sentence sat on the page like a crime. In Berlin, the Ministry of Propaganda distributed a new leaflet that week. It showed a rough sketch of an American prison camp, a barbed wire hellscape with skeletal Germans chained to posts, a masked guard holding a whip in one hand and a ration tin in the other. "So-called humane treatment," the caption read. "Don't believe their lies." None of Karl's men ever saw the sketch, but they lived with the assumption behind it. Hauptfeldwebel Dietrich Kerner had gathered them in the mess hall 2 days earlier with a warning. "Any softness toward the Americans will be seen as betrayal. They want your minds more than your muscles." He stood straight, shoulders squared as always, the folds of his uniform ironed into defiant lines. "We are soldiers of Germany, not guests of these men." Carl remembered how the light from the bakery oven had still been warming his sleeves when he returned to the barracks that day. He had not told Dietrich that Sal had given him extra flour to try a new dough ratio. He had not told anyone that Private Green had asked, quietly, if Carl missed home. Some truths were warm and dangerous. Outside, Elliot Green stuffed envelopes into the outgoing mail sack, pausing at one bearing the returned name F. Boymer. He knew that name, Friedrich, the one who barely spoke but always nodded with a clipped politeness. Elliot didn't know what the letter said. His job wasn't censorship, but he'd noticed the length of it. Almost 8 pages. A rarity. He tucked it carefully into the canvas pouch and called out, "Mail's closing." Behind him, Dietrich emerged from the shadows of the corridor. "Is it standard for enemy prisoners to write so frequently?" he asked, tone neutral. Elliot blinked. "It's their right, sir." Red Cross mandates. Dietrich gave a slow nod, then murmured, "I wonder how many of them know the letters will never reach the truth." He walked away, boots clicking on cold concrete. That night, Carl stayed up after lights out, hunched beneath a wool blanket with his journal lit by a contraband stub of candle. Friedrich lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. "Do you think Emil will get in trouble?" Friedrich whispered. "He already did," Carl replied, flipping a page. "His letter was marked." "They won't let it out." Friedrich sat up slightly. "But what did he write that was so wrong?" Carl didn't answer right away. He dipped the tip of his pencil and scrawled another private entry beneath his earlier thought. "Mercy is not the enemy, but silence is expected." Then he added, "We are learning how to live again, but we're not allowed to say so." The next day, a new Red Cross inspector was scheduled to arrive. Rumors spread through the camp. Some believed he would interview prisoners. Others thought he would merely inspect supplies. Carl overheard 2 guards talking outside the bakery, debating whether to hide the chessboards gifted by American church groups. "They'll say it's propaganda," one guard muttered. "That's exactly what it is," the other replied, "just not the kind anyone expected." When the inspector finally arrived, tall, with a British accent and a clipboard, Dietrich lined the men up in the yard like it was parade day. The American commandant, Colonel Jasper Liddell, gave a brief overview of camp operations, pointing out sanitation, food rations, recreation privileges. The inspector nodded politely but said little. Carl stood motionless, heart pounding as the inspector passed by him. Did the man see the flour under his fingernails? The tiny scorch on his cuff where hot dough had burst? Did he know? Later, the inspector entered the mail processing room. He was shown samples of censored letters. Emil's was among them. The inspector read the redacted version and frowned. "Any reasons for this one?" he asked. The clerk shrugged. "Prisoner wrote that the Americans were kind." Orders say we flag any content that could mislead families back home. Mislead? The inspector narrowed his eyes. Or correct. The room fell silent. That evening, Carl sat with Friedrich on a bench behind the mess hall, their coats wrapped tight as the sky darkened to iron. Snow began to fall, light at first, then faster. "I wrote something today," Carl said. "In the journal." Carl nodded. Friedrich glanced around. "You shouldn't." "I know." Carl looked down at his palms. "But if I don't, I'll forget what this was. I'll forget what it meant, to be wrong about someone." They sat in silence for a long while. From the kitchen, the scent of bread wafted out, yeasty, warm, impossible to distrust. Sal's laughter echoed faintly. Back in his bunk that night, Carl opened the journal once more and underlined his earlier entry. "They are not what we were told." Then he turned the page as if preparing for a truth that would someday be allowed to live outside the wire. Friedrich flung a lump of dough onto the floured table with a theatrical grunt. "Behold," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm, "the great American elephant." The other POWs around him chuckled nervously as he pinched 2 stubby ears into the malformed blob. The air inside the kitchen was warm with the scent of rising loaves and faint laughter, something rare and almost suspicious. Private First Class Elliot Green stood just beyond the doorway, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised. He watched as Carl helped shape dozens of loaves, pressing his fingers gently into the dough like it were something sacred. Across the table, Sal Donetti, the Italian-American supervisor, wiped his hands on his apron and chuckled. "Krusty," he said again, pointing at Carl, then at the bread. "Krusty, bread man." Carl gave a cautious smile, repeating the word in broken English. Krusty. The mood was absurd, nearly surreal. Just weeks ago, these same men had flinched at every creaking pipe, every rising chimney plume. Now they stood elbow to elbow with the people they were trained to hate, sharing flour and inside jokes. One young POW, Emil, mimed juggling 3 dough balls while whistling off-key. Even Friedrich, the most suspicious among them, was laughing so hard he nearly tipped over a mixing bowl. But not everyone found the scene amusing. The screen door slammed open. Boots clomped across the linoleum floor, sharp, heavy, practiced. A man in a dark military coat stepped inside, eyes scanning the room with surgical precision. Lieutenant Harold Brinks from Military Intelligence. His presence was a warning all by itself. Creased uniform, spotless gloves, clipboard tucked under one arm. He said nothing at first, just watched. The laughter dissolved instantly. Sal's hands dropped from mid-need to stillness. Carl swallowed hard. The warm air suddenly felt stifling. "Lieutenant Brinks," Sal greeted, his smile forced. "Just bread and bad jokes today." Brinks ignored him. His gaze moved to Friedrich, who held a dough animal half-shaped into something between a dog and a bear. "You think this is a game, soldier?" Brinks said, voice low and cutting. "No, sir," Friedrich replied, stiffening. His English wasn't perfect, but the tone needed no translation. Brinks circled the room like a bloodhound, tapping his pen against his clipboard. "Enemy morale appears suspiciously high," he said, dictating as he walked. "Observed, laughter, name-sharing, fraternization with guards, culinary assignments without oversight." He stopped in front of Carl. "What's your name?" "Carl Boimer," Carl answered. "Breadman, is it?" Brinks asked, eyes narrowing. "That what they call you?" Carl said nothing. Brinks turned to Sal. "Pull them. Both of them. I want them reassigned. You're creating a circus, not a detention facility." Sal stepped forward, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Sir, with all due respect, these boys are working hard. We're feeding the whole camp off their effort. There's no circus here." Brinks didn't even glance at him. "You're not in charge of morale evaluations." Later that afternoon, the order came down from Colonel Jasper Liddell's office. Carl and Friedrich were to be removed from kitchen duties effective immediately. They were marched out of the mess hall in silence, aprons still tied around their waists, the smell of yeast clinging to their clothes. Inside the barracks that night, Friedrich sat rigid on the edge of his bunk, fists clenched. Around him, the other prisoners sat in stunned quiet, the air heavy with uncertainty. They think this, he motioned to his flour-covered sleeves, "Idik is weakness, that it makes us less German." Karl didn't answer. He stared down at his hands, the same hands that had carried sacks of flour and shaped dough for weeks, now trembling. Finally, Friedrich stood. His voice shook, but it carried. "It gave me purpose," he shouted in English thick with emotion. "Baking gave me something to live for." The entire barracks stilled. Even the guards outside the door paused. The next morning, none of the POWs reported for kitchen duty. Sal arrived to find empty workstations and untouched mixing bowls. On each table sat one hand-shaped lump of dough, silent symbols of protest. In Berlin, the state broadcast continued its steady beat of propaganda. That week's update: American camps now brand enemy soldiers with hot irons in makeshift ovens. The lie traveled fast. It always did. But inside Fort Devonshire, in a silent mess hall, Karl stood beside Friedrich, their hands still dusted with flour. They had found warmth in a place built for cold. And now, even that warmth was under suspicion. The truth, like the bread, was invisible to those who refused to taste it. We were mocked for our fear, then punished for our hope. Otto collapsed just after midnight. The wind screamed outside the barracks, slipping through cracks in the wooden walls like icy fingers probing for flesh. Inside, the stoves had long since gone cold. The power failure had hit the camp just after evening roll call. First, the lights blinked, then went dark altogether. Pipes burst in two of the wash huts. Blankets barely covered the shivering bodies that lay curled on cots, breathing in clouds. Men coughed in their sleep, teeth chattering, arms wrapped around themselves. And then Otto, the oldest among them, a quiet tailor from Leipzig, let out a strangled gasp and sank to the wooden floorboards. Karl was the first to reach him. "Otto!" Karl knelt, pressing a hand to the older man's forehead. It was damp, but his cheeks were pale, lips beginning to blue. Friedrich hovered behind him, clutching a lantern with a dimming flame. The shadows cast by its flicker danced wildly across the bunk walls, warping their anxious faces. "We need heat." "He won't survive another hour like this," Karl said, his voice low but firm. A few other POWs stirred from nearby bunks, watching silently. No one moved. No one had any idea what to do. The infirmary was just as powerless, its tiny stove out of commission, blankets rationed. Friedrich looked around, jaw clenched. "The oven," he muttered. "The bakery still has the oven." Karl paused. The idea hit him like a slap. "It runs on wood, not electricity," he said, eyes widening. "Exactly." Within minutes, they were wrapping Otto in everything they could find: scarves, aprons, even a curtain ripped from the barrack window. Karl lifted him under the shoulders while Friedrich supported the legs. They carried him out into the storm, boots crunching over fresh snow, heads bent against the wind. The mess hall loomed ahead like a dark barn. Its windows were frosted, its entrance nearly buried in drifts. Karl kicked it open, nearly stumbling as they entered. Inside, the cold was no better, but the oven stood at the far end, quiet and massive, like a sleeping beast. Sal Donetti, the bakery supervisor, was still there. He sat at a table, wrapped in a coat, rubbing his hands together and mumbling to himself in English. When he saw them barge in with Otto, his eyes widened. "What the hell?" Karl didn't wait for permission. "The oven," he said, voice hoarse. "We need it." "He's dying." Sal stood, blinking. "That old man?" "Jesus. All right." He moved fast for someone who had been half-frozen minutes earlier. "Stacked wood still behind the kitchen. Go." He tossed Friedrich a ring of keys. "Fire that thing up like you're cooking for the devil." Carl laid Otto gently on a sack of flour near the oven and covered him with layered aprons and baking cloths. The man barely stirred, eyes fluttering behind cold, stiffened lids. The room filled with the sounds of labor, wood slamming into the furnace, the roar of heat beginning to pulse and the crackle of dry logs catching flame. Sal worked the ignition controls and turned the oven dials like a conductor setting an orchestra in motion. "She'll be hot in 10, he muttered, kneeling beside Otto and pressing a hand to his chest. Still, breathing. Good. As the room warmed, other prisoners began to arrive. Word had spread. First 2, then 5, then nearly a dozen came stumbling through the snow, blankets wrapped around their shoulders, arms carrying frail comrades or pulling them along. The mess hall became a strange sanctuary, half bakery, half hospital. They lined the walls, curled up along the benches, pressed near the oven like moths to a flame. Friedrich crouched beside Otto, gripping his hand. "He's warmer," he said. "Color's coming back." Carl exhaled, finally sitting back against the tiled wall, his hands still trembling. He glanced around at the faces surrounding them, some smiling weakly, others still frozen with uncertainty. The same oven that had haunted their dreams now glowed like a fireplace at the heart of a home they never expected to find. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the soft hum of fire and an occasional cough. A kettle had been placed on top of the oven, now steaming gently. Someone brewed a crude broth. Sal, humming faintly, baked a few small loaves from leftover dough. Their scent, yeast and heat and mercy, floated through the air. Otto stirred. His fingers twitched and his lips parted just enough to whisper, "Warm." Friedrich squeezed his hand, eyes wet with relief. "You're safe, old man," he said softly. "You're safe." When the Red Cross inspectors finally arrived weeks later, delayed by snow and bureaucracy, they were surprised to find handwritten logs in the mess hall detailing every hour the oven had been kept running, every man warmed, every life saved. Sal, unshaven and proud, handed over the pages without ceremony. One inspector, a British officer with wire-rimmed glasses, lingered. He looked down at the logs, then up at the men standing quietly beside the oven. Friedrich stepped forward, carrying something round in both hands. A loaf of bread, fresh, golden, its crust still warm. He placed it in the officer's gloved palms without a word. The man looked down at it, then slowly nodded. No words were spoken. But the report that left Fort Devonshire that day included more than temperature readings and head counts. It spoke of heat, of shelter, of an oven that had been feared and misunderstood until it had saved a man's life. In the place we feared death, we learned how warmth could save. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of fear, misunderstanding, and the humanity that can emerge even in times of war. Its purpose is to raise awareness about perception versus reality and to inspire empathy, reflection, and hope for reconciliation across divides.